A client who kept his word. This is the story of an unusual client. In late 1998, a senior lawyer planned to retire. He handed over one of his litigation files to me. He said he would send his client across. Hello, my name is Ganesan, and this is the true story of a client who kept his word. A meeting was arranged with the client of Mr. Lee. It was scheduled at 10 a.m. On the appointed day, at about 2 minutes before 10 a.m., the receptionist called saying, Mr. Lee is waiting for you. Shortly, two elderly men appeared at my door. Mr. Lee was a pale, wiry man with thinning white hair. He was, I thought, every inch an old-fashioned ethnic Chinese tycoon. He oozed quite confidence and power. He was accompanied by an equally elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Tan. He made a profound bow towards Mr. Lee and then addressed me. This is Mr. Lee and I am Mr. Tan. I have come to translate for Mr. Lee. I will have you know that I was a court interpreter for 40 years. There are many Chinese business associations, or kongsis as we call them in the country. There is an umbrella organization that heads them. Mr. Lee is its chairman. Now all that sounded like an unnecessary medieval pre-battle introduction between warriors. It sounded ominous and it irritated me. It was only then that Mr. Lee took his seat. Mr. Tan, surprisingly, and despite my many entreaties, remained standing. Mr. Lee spoke and Mr. Tan translated. Now, Mr. Lee's opening salvo was quite unnerving. With all the authority of a king and with a clear bell-like voice, Mr. Lee asked, "Have you read the brief?" I said I had. It was a simple story. Mr. Lee owned a commercial property in upmarket Bangsa. He had entered into an agreement to sell it for Rm 1.5 million ringgit. The purchaser had paid a deposit of Rm 150,000. The balance purchase price of 1,350,000 was to be paid within 90 days of the date of the payment of the deposit. If the buyer defaulted, the law allowed Mr. Lee, as did his agreement, to terminate the agreement and forfeit the deposit. It happened that it was only on the 92nd day that the buyer had proffered a banker's check for the balance purchase price. Not unsurprisingly, Mr. Lee's solicitor had, without consulting the client, terminated the agreement, and he had also forfeited the deposit. Now, this had been several years earlier. The buyer sued Mr. Lee. I was a bit surprised. I thought he would never win. The buyer wished to go through with the sale. By the time the case came to court, the property had shot up in value by almost 300%. All Mr. Lee had to prove was that the buyer had crossed the 90-day mark, and the evidence in Mr. Lee's favor was overwhelming. Beyond that, there were two letters from the buyer's lawyer. He had in fact admitted to the delay and implored Mr. Lee's solicitors, in his own words, to use your good offices to enable the transaction to go through, as he said, in good faith. So why had Mr. Lee come to see me? In our interview, what followed was an awkward conversation, and it went like this. It was translated by the ex-court interpreter, Mr. Tan, in a torrent of Chinese. "Mr. Lee, are you up to it?" A little miffed. I said, "Yes." "Mr. Lee, do you have any idea who my previous counsel have been?" I say, "No." "Well," Mr. Lee says, "listen to this list," and he rattles off a name of at least 5 lawyers, all of whom were current sitting judges of the Court of Appeal or the Federal Court. Again, Mr. Lee asked, "So, can you do it?" Irritated by this time, I said, "Sir, I can. If you're not comfortable with me, I'm sure your solicitor can recommend someone of your choice." Mr. Lee retorted, "That won't be necessary. My solicitor seems to have some confidence in you, so we'll go with you." He paused. He looked askance at Mr. Tan. "For now," he said. So he had come to size me up. We discussed fees. I quoted a figure. It was quite substantial. He didn't negotiate. Waving a dismissive hand at Mr. Tan, he rose, saying, "That'll be arranged." And guess what? The fees arrived in cash in a matter of hours. The trial was only days away. We scrambled the team. We slogged through the weekend. We read every conceivable authority, case law, and statutes. When the trial began, the plaintiff's counsel put a finger on the pulse of the case. He said to the judge, "Everything depends on when time had started to run. How is time to be calculated? And the question is whether we paid the money in 90 days. So like good old-fashioned lawyers, we confined ourselves to that issue only, that is to say the calculation of time and all the evidence relating to it, and we ignored everything else. Now the plaintiff's counsel was thorough. He called witnesses and showed the trial judge the agreement, ensuing correspondence between the parties, and other documents. He tried to establish his case with quiet efficiency. Then it was my turn to cross-examine the plaintiff's star witness. I turned and I looked at the gallery where Mr. Lee and Mr. Tan sat. When we scored a point, Mr. Tan would nod. The cadaverous Mr. Lee betrayed no emotion. All the while I could sense his eyes boring into my back. During cross, as we lawyers call it, we forced the plaintiff's main witness to admit that payments had in fact been made late. Only after the 92nd day had the balance purchase price been paid. I continued to probe, seeking more admissions. At one point, trying to evade the onslaught, the witness blurted, "Although we might have been late by a few days, Mr. Lee actually waived the delay. He said he was prepared to go ahead with the agreement. And this is why we sent across the banker's check for RM 1,135,000. I heard a sudden rustle in the gallery. I turned around. Mr. Lee was on his feet, livid. He pointed a tremulous finger at the witness. "Liar!" he hissed. In the sepulchral silence of the court, it was as if a cannon had gone off. Bristling with fury, the plaintiff's counsel rose to protest. The judge waved him down and peered at me over his spectacles. "You might wish to rein in your client. Any more of this histrionics, and I will throw him out." He stared at Mr. Lee pointedly. "Please, sir, Mr. Lee," I implored, "do please remain seated and silent." Subsiding, Mr. Lee shook his head. "I'm a gentleman," he muttered darkly, "and if I had said it, I would have kept my word." For the entire duration of the plaintiff's case, Mr. Lee continued to regard the plaintiff's witnesses with the venom and intent of a cobra eyeing a trapped mouse. By their third witness, the plaintiff's case had crumpled to cross-examination. Deflated, the plaintiff's counsel closed his case. Was it a no case to answer situation? At a time like this, defense counsel can either call his evidence and challenge the plaintiff's case, and in the clearest cases, he can argue that there was nothing to answer and say to the trial judge, "No case to answer." It was almost lunch. The trial judge seemed to point to the latter course. "Gentlemen," he said, nodding towards me, "please return after lunch and tell me what you intend to do." There was no question in my mind that our client had won the case hands down. Now, during lunch, one of our lawyers made a remark about another case. He said that as Christmas would soon be upon us, we shall have to complete the work on two other unrelated appeal briefs in quick order. Suddenly, a horrible doubt began to gnaw at me. Public holiday? The law and the facts were clearly on our side. But if the parties had decided in the agreement to calculate time in a prearranged fashion, it didn't matter what the law said. So what had the parties agreed? The team's view was I was overreacting. A standard sale agreement would simply follow the general law, they said. Second, after all, it was our client's previous solicitor who had drafted the agreement. He couldn't have made an error. And third, it was he who had triggered the deposit clause. Fourth, it was he who had forfeited the deposit. 5, surely he could not have overlooked so basic a point. Next, the defendants had pleaded their case on that assumption, and we had broken the plaintiff's case. So, the ensuing correspondence between the parties had also said nothing about any such arrangement. Both sides had proceeded on the assumption that no such clause existed. So the team thought I was being over-anxious. However, I was deeply troubled. So troubled, in fact, that I began to plunge through the reams of trial records. Imagine my horror when I discovered that a contractual clause placed in an unobtrusive appendix said, in ascertaining time, public holidays shall be excluded. Neither party had noticed it. Witnesses had not been asked questions on any public holidays. Even the judge, known for his eagle eye, had missed it. Several questions assailed my mind. What had been the date of the agreement? What was the date of the 90th day? Between those two dates, were there any public holidays? I asked team members to locate some old calendars. Frantic calls were made to chambers. 2 calendars were rushed to the court canteen. When we consulted them, we found that both pointed to a Chinese New Year holiday that had been completely overlooked, and the holidays had a duration of exactly 2 days. We calculated and recalculated the days. We cross-checked each other's notes. Eventually, I concluded that the plaintiffs had paid the balance purchase price on time. Now, Mr. Lee had to be told, but he wasn't to be found. He had returned to his office. I called him. He promised to hurry back to court. Meanwhile, when we got back into court, the judge insisted that we continue with our proceedings. I told the judge that I had to confer with my client, and he looked very displeased. I asked for a short recess. He seemed unhappy. What on earth are you waiting for? Plead a no case to answer, man, seems to be the silent answer of his raised eyebrow. When Mr. Lee reached the court, I told him all about it. He regarded me silently for a few minutes. Are you sure? He asked. I said yes. So, what should we do now? Crestfallen, I said, we need to concede liability. You'd lose your case and you would lose your property. It is now 3 times more than the price you sold it. I offered him a weak apology. Smiling, he said, I'm a gentleman. He placed a hand upon my forearm and he said, I keep my word. Tell the judge what you think is right. It's not your fault. So I tell the judge. The trial judge shook his head. He thought I was quite off my head. Are you sure? He asked me. Let me look at the clause. He read it. He reread it. Eventually he said, I agree with you. So, what now? Well, I asked for a consent judgment. My opponents were overjoyed, but there was yet another ruffle at the gallery. Mr. Lee was addressing the judge. I groaned inside. I heard a clear voice telling the judge, I'm a gentleman, my lord, he said, in flawless English. My counsel tells me it's not fair for me to proceed in this way. If this is what my counsel says, then I will do as he says. The property will be delivered to the buyer so long as they pay the balance purchase price. We recorded a consent judgment, and for his part, the judge mercifully did not order costs against us. As the judge rose to depart, he nodded in my direction and thanked Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee bowed low. The buyer's solicitors paid the balance purchase price of $1,350,000 into our client's account. I sent a message to Mr. Tan asking Mr. Lee to collect his check. Mr. Tan called me back. He said Mr. Lee was scheduled to undergo a pre-arranged coronary surgery in Singapore. Mr. Tan said Mr. Lee would be in touch with you after his surgery. Keep the money in your account. Well, a week passed. We were busy with work. My phone rang. It was a receptionist, and she said, Sir, it's about old man Lee. It's his relative calling from Singapore. I said to myself, oh dear, what now? Expecting the worst, I attended to the call. My name is Peter, said an Oxford accented voice on the other side, and I am Mr. Lee's son-in-law. I asked after Mr. Lee's health. Peter said the surgery had been successful, but Mr. Lee's health was not looking up. He had a burning question. He asked if the balance purchase price had been paid into our client's account. Unfortunately, the words shot out of my mouth even before I could think about it. Mr. Lee is my client and not you. I cannot at all discuss the details of the case with you. The son-in-law said a few choice words to me and called off. After the call, I suffered a sudden anxiety. What if my words had displeased Mr. Lee? I had been shot with one of his relatives. A fortnight passed. Mr. Tan telephoned again. He asked for an appointment at 10 a.m. the next day. Knowing Mr. Lee's punctuality, exactly a minute before 10 a.m., I made my way to the reception and there to be confronted by a motley group of men. Behind a frail and pallid Mr. Lee stood a beaming Mr. Tan, and just off to him, to the side, stood two workmen. They bore a large tarpaulin-wrapped object. Mr. Lee rose with a spring. With uncharacteristic warmth, he slapped my forearm and pumped my hand vigorously. I said weakly, "I'm sorry, sir, but I could say nothing to your son-in-law." He waved an energetic thumbs up before my face. We made our way to my chambers. The man followed. I wondered why. As we got into my room, Mr. Lee closed the door and he said, "You know, in business, honor is the most crucial factor. Thank you for preserving my name, my honor, and my integrity." He then uttered many benedictions. Mr. Tan was bobbing his head, smiling all the while. Imperiously, Mr. Lee waved to the workmen. They unraveled a long black wooden plaque. It was exceedingly heavy. On it were engraved in gold filigree several Chinese words. I asked for a translation. Mr. Tan explained that it was an old, possibly forgotten Chinese custom to compliment one's professionals. He said the words were complimentary of our firm and our services. I shan't go too much into that. Complimentary was good enough for me. As he was leaving, Mr. Lee pressed an envelope into my hand. When I opened it after he left, it bore a check for a large sum, larger than my fee, which Mr. Lee had already paid. Months later, I received a call from Mr. Tan. His voice was somber and tinged with sadness. "I fear I have bad news. Mr. Lee passed away last night." That night we recited a prayer for Mr. Lee. I have never forgotten him. He was the man who kept his word. His plaque adorns our reception. To this day it's over there. And each time I look at it, an enormous sense of warmth floods my heart. I know not why. Thank you for listening. I will see you again with another episode in GKtv. Please share this video widely. Please subscribe. Please press like and ring that bell. Goodbye.